The Galactic Council's most sophisticated translation matrix had never failed before. For 3,000 cycles, it had seamlessly bridged the communication gaps between 17,000 species across 8 spiral arms of the galaxy. But now, in the presence of the crystalline Marn delegation, it was producing nothing but nonsense. High Interpreter ZX-427 twisted their primary sensory stalk in frustration as another burst of electromagnetic pulses from the Marn representatives scattered across their instruments in a dazzling but incomprehensible display. The Marn were simultaneously emitting light patterns from their crystalline bodies, releasing complex pheromone chains, and generating subsonic vibrations that made the council chamber's walls hum. Most respected delegates, ZX-427 broadcast in Standard Galactic. We request that you limit your communication to a single channel. Our systems cannot process multiple information streams simultaneously. The Marn's response was even more complex, their crystalline forms now oscillating through the entire visible spectrum, while their electromagnetic emissions doubled in intensity. The translation matrix sparked and went dark. In the ensuing chaos, no one noticed the human observer in the corner of the chamber. Dr. Sarah Chen, Earth's junior diplomatic attaché, was furiously taking notes on her datapad. Her eyes darted between the spectral analysis readings and the crystalline beings, her mind racing with recognition. It wasn't until the third day of failed negotiations that desperation drove Senior Counselor Ven-8 to acknowledge the humans' increasingly insistent requests to speak. The junior species may address the council, they announced with poorly concealed disdain. Sarah stood, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Honorable Council, the Marn aren't using multiple channels of communication. They're using a single integrated language. Every element, light, electromagnetic pulses, pheromones, and vibrations, is part of a single semantic structure. It's like, she paused, searching for an analogy the council would understand. It's like how we humans use not just words, but tone, facial expressions, and body language to convey meaning. The chamber fell silent. The Marn's crystals pulsed with a soft blue light that Sarah was beginning to recognize as interest. Impossible, declared Ven-8. No species can process multiple information streams as a single language. The cognitive load would be. We do it every day, Sarah interrupted, earning several shocked gasps from the more traditional council members. Human children learn to interpret words, tones, and body language simultaneously before they can even speak. We evolved on a planet where missing any single aspect of communication could mean death. A predator's growl, the subtle shift in their stance before they pounce, the scent of their aggression. Survival meant processing everything at once. The Marn's crystalline forms began to resonate with a harmonic frequency that made Sarah's teeth tingle. Their light patterns shifted to a deep purple she hadn't seen before. She turned to face them directly. You're not just talking, are you? She asked. You're singing. Every frequency, every color, every chemical signal is part of a greater harmony. The Marn's response was immediate and overwhelming. Their bodies erupted in a symphony of light and energy that the council's instruments struggled to record. But Sarah stood transfixed, her mind trained by evolution to piece together multiple streams of information into a coherent whole. They're saying yes, she whispered. They're also saying they've been trying to tell us about an incoming threat to the galaxy, but our insistence on single-channel communication meant we were only hearing a fraction of their warning. The council chamber erupted in chaos. Ven-8's dorsal spines flared in alarm. What threat? What have we been missing? Sarah held up her hand for silence, her attention still focused on the Marn's complex communication. There's something crossing the void between galaxies, something that communicates in ways we haven't even imagined yet. The Marn detected it 3 cycles ago, but couldn't make us understand the full scope of the situation. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Galactic Council. Their most fundamental assumptions about communication had been shattered, and with them, their confidence in their ability to face whatever was approaching from intergalactic space. As the council dissolved into urgent discussions, Sarah found herself surrounded by Marn delegates. Their crystalline forms shimmered with patterns she was only beginning to understand, but their meaning was becoming clearer with each passing moment. They had chosen to make first contact with the Galactic Council because of its reputation for unity and technological advancement. Instead, they had found a community fundamentally limited by its own assumptions about how intelligence could be expressed. But in the humans, the Deathworlders who had evolved to process multiple streams of information just to survive their harsh planet, they had found kindred spirits, species who understood that true communication transcended simple linear exchanges of information. As Sarah began the painstaking process of teaching the Council's xenolinguists how to perceive integrated communication streams, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. Humanity, often dismissed as primitive due to their violent homeworld, would now become the teachers of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. The Mern's next transmission contained something that needed no translation, a pattern of light and energy that matched the rhythm of Sarah's smile. Perhaps, she thought, this was the real reason humanity had evolved such complex communication skills, not just to survive their harsh world, but to someday help the galaxy survive something even more challenging, the need to understand those who were truly different. As the council chamber hummed with new possibilities, Sarah began composing her report to Earth. How could she possibly explain that humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization wouldn't be their technology or their military strength, but their ability to understand what others thought impossible to express? The Mern's crystals pulsed one final time before the session ended, and this time Sarah understood perfectly. It wasn't just a message. It was an invitation. The galaxy was about to change, and humanity would help lead the way. 6 months after the historic first contact with the Mern, the Galactic Council's central communication hub had been transformed. Where once stood rows of translation matrices, now holographic displays showed overlapping waves of light, sound, and chemical signatures. And at the center of it all stood Dr. Sarah Chen, surrounded by a team of human specialists drawn from fields ranging from linguistics to interpretive dance. Again, Sarah commanded, as her team demonstrated to a group of alien observers. Watch how every element combines to create meaning. The humans began their demonstration. A linguist spoke in Mandarin, while a dancer moved in synchronized patterns. A musician played a soft melody on a synthesizer, while a perfumer released carefully timed scents into the air. To most of the alien observers, it appeared chaotic, until they saw their Mern colleagues resonating in perfect understanding. This is how we've always communicated, Sarah explained to the astonished audience. We just never realized how unique it was when a human says, "I'm fine," but their tone is sharp, their shoulders are tense, and they won't make eye contact. We instinctively know they're not fine at all. We process dozens of contradictory signals simultaneously and extract the true meaning. Admiral Kex of the Hegemony Forces clicked his mandibles skeptically. And you expect us to believe that this sensory overload is more efficient than direct neural communication? Sarah smiled, recognizing the familiar resistance. Admiral, may I demonstrate something? Could you deliver a message to me using your neural transmitter? The insectoid admiral's antenna twitched as he sent a simple neural pulse. Sarah's human colleagues monitoring the transmission equipment nodded. You just told me that your forces are ready for inspection, Sarah said. But because you're limited to a single channel of communication, I don't know if you're proud of your troops, worried about their preparedness, or trying to intimidate me. A Mern could tell me all of that and more in a single burst of integrated communication. The Admiral's compound eyes flickered in what Sarah had learned to recognize as surprise. Before he could respond, an urgent alert filled the chamber. A Mern delegation had detected something approaching from the galactic core, something that defied traditional sensors. The chamber's displays erupted with data as the Mern transmitted their findings. To the alien observers, it was an overwhelming cascade of information. But Sarah and her team were already breaking it down, their Deathworld evolved brains processing the layers of meaning. "It's a ship," Sarah announced, her voice tight with concern. "No, not just one ship. It's thousands, maybe millions. They're using some kind of quantum-entangled communication that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. That's why our standard sensors can barely detect them." Admiral Kex's antennae went rigid. Impossible. No species could coordinate such a fleet without clear, direct communication protocols. "Unless," Sarah countered, "they've evolved beyond our concept of clear and direct. Just as the Mern used multiple channels as a single language, these beings might use multiple dimensions as a single reality." The implications hit the chamber like a physical force. The galaxy's standard communication protocols, the very foundation of their unified civilization, might be useless against this new threat. But as panic began to spread, Sarah noticed something peculiar in the Mern's transmission. "They're not just warning us," she said, her eyes widening. "They're showing us how to perceive the dimensional communications. Look at the harmonic patterns in their crystal resonance, the way it matches the quantum fluctuations we're detecting." Sarah turned to her team. "Carmen, match the harmonic frequency with your synthesizer. May, mirror the energy patterns in your movements. David, start mapping the chemical signatures." As the humans began to synchronize their various forms of expression with the Mern's transmission, something extraordinary happened. The seemingly random data on the displays began to coalesce into recognizable patterns. The approaching fleet wasn't just communicating, it was singing across dimensions, telling a story that could only be understood when all layers were perceived simultaneously. "They're refugees," Sarah breathed, as the full message became clear. "They're fleeing something even more incomprehensible than themselves, and they're asking for asylum. But their request contains information about their culture, their history, their hopes and fears, all encoded in ways we never imagined possible." Admiral Kex stepped forward, his earlier skepticism replaced with a new understanding, and without the humans' ability to integrate these different forms of communication. "We would have seen them as invaders," Sarah finished, "just as we initially saw the Mern's complex communication as chaos." The Admiral's mandibles worked silently for a moment. "Perhaps," he finally said, "we have been too quick to dismiss humanity's unique evolution. Your violent homeworld forced you to develop skills we never needed, skills we now desperately require." Sarah smiled, but her mind was already racing ahead to the challenges to come. Teaching the galaxy to understand the Mern had been difficult enough. Now they faced the task of communicating with beings who existed partially in other dimensions. But as she watched her human colleagues working in perfect synchronization with the Mern, each contributing their own layer to a greater whole, she felt a surge of hope. Humanity had spent its entire history learning to understand what others thought impossible to express. Perhaps this was their true purpose in the galaxy, not to fight wars or build empires, but to help different forms of life understand each other. The displays showed the refugee fleet drawing closer, their multidimensional song growing stronger. Sarah squared her shoulders and began organizing her team. They had work to do, and the future of galactic communication would never be the same. The quantum refugees arrived in a display that defied conventional physics. Their ships phased between dimensions like sheets of iridescent rain, each transition releasing cascades of information that only the combined efforts of human interpreters and Mern resonators could begin to decode. From her new position as Chief of Multidimensional Communications, Dr. Sarah Chen watched the arrival from the Council's recently constructed Harmonic Observatory. The massive facility, built specifically to interface with the quantum refugees, represented everything humanity had taught the galaxy about integrated communication over the past year. "They're settling into a resonance pattern," announced Dr. James Okonjo, the quantum physicist who had pioneered the translation of dimensional shifts into musical frequencies. His fingers danced across a modified synthesizer, matching the refugees' dimensional harmonics. "But there's something different about this transmission." Sarah felt it too. After months of working with the quantum refugees, She had learned to recognize the subtle patterns in their multidimensional communications. This was something new, an urgency that set her Deathworlder instincts on edge. Full spectrum analysis, she ordered. Around her, human specialists began their synchronized interpretation dance. A team of musicians matched dimensional frequencies with sound, while movement artists translated spatial distortions into dance. Biochemists monitored the complex pheromone signatures that leaked between dimensions, and neural interpreters mapped the quantum entanglement patterns. The Marn delegates in the chamber began to resonate in response, their crystalline forms adding another layer to the complex interpretation. But it was a junior human interpreter, Marina Santos, who first grasped the full meaning. "They're not just communicating," Marina gasped, her hands freezing mid-gesture. "They're trying to show us something. Something they've been too afraid to reveal until now." The chamber's holographic displays erupted with new data as the quantum refugees began what could only be described as a multidimensional symphony. It was communication on a scale that even the Marn found overwhelming. A story told through quantum states, dimensional shifts, and mathematical harmonies. Sarah's trained mind began assembling the pieces. "They're showing us what they're running from," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And why they chose our galaxy specifically." The story unfolded across multiple dimensions of space and time. The quantum refugees had once been like the Galactic Council races, bound to traditional forms of communication. But they had evolved, learning to exist partially in other dimensions, their consciousness spreading across multiple planes of reality. It should have been their greatest achievement. Instead, it had attracted something from the spaces between galaxies, something that consumed consciousness itself. "It's a predator," Sarah realized, her Deathworlder instincts screaming warnings her conscious mind could barely process. A predator that hunts through dimensions, drawn to complex forms of consciousness like a shark to blood and water. The Marn's crystals pulsed with patterns that matched her horror. The quantum refugees' symphony continued, revealing why they had fled to this particular galaxy. They had detected something unique here, a species whose consciousness was naturally adapted to integrating multiple streams of information, yet remained firmly anchored in physical reality. "They mean us," Dr. Okonjo said, his synthesizer falling silent. "Human consciousness, our ability to process multiple forms of communication while maintaining our limited dimensional existence." Sarah nodded slowly. "We're not as evolved as the quantum refugees. We can't exist in multiple dimensions, but we can understand them, interpret them, while staying rooted in our own reality. We're like translators who can read a foreign language without being absorbed by its culture." The implications rippled through the chamber. Humanity's supposedly primitive nature, their evolution on a dangerous world that forced them to remain physically bound while developing complex information processing abilities, might be the key to saving consciousness itself. The quantum refugees' symphony reached a crescendo, revealing their proposal. They needed humanity's help to develop a new form of communication, one that could maintain complexity without attracting the dimensional predator. A way to compress multiple layers of meaning into forms that appeared simple on the surface. "They want us to teach them to be more like us," Sarah realized. "To learn how to communicate complex ideas through limited channels, just as we use tone, gesture, and expression to layer meaning into simple speech." Dr. Okonjo laughed suddenly. All those critics who said humans were too primitive for galactic society, too bound to our physical forms, and it turns out that's exactly what the galaxy needs. But Sarah was already moving, her mind racing with possibilities. "We need to assemble a new team," she announced. "Poets, composers, dancers, anyone who knows how to compress complex meanings into simple forms. The quantum refugees have shown us the threat. Now we need to show them how to hide their consciousness in plain sight." As the chamber erupted into activity, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in one of the crystalline Marn delegates. A year ago, she had been teaching the galaxy how to understand complex communication. Now she would teach them something equally important, How to communicate complexity through simplicity. The quantum refugee ships shimmered in dimensional space, waiting for humanity's response. In the depths between galaxies, something vast and hungry stirred, drawn by the light of evolving consciousness. But for the first time since they had begun their flight, the refugees felt something new. Perhaps the Deathworlders, with their strange mix of primitive existence and complex understanding, could teach them how to survive. Perhaps humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy would not be showing them how to speak across dimensions, but how to whisper in ways that predators could not hear. In the 6 months since the quantum refugees revealed the threat of the dimensional predator, the Harmonic Observatory had transformed into humanity's greatest teaching center. But today, all lessons had stopped. The dimensional sensors were screaming. It's crossed the galactic boundary. Dr. Sarah Chen announced to the emergency session of the Galactic Council. The chamber was packed with representatives from every known species, their various forms of communication creating a cascade of anxiety that only the humans could fully interpret. The predator is drawn to complex consciousness signatures, she continued, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her subtle body language. The quantum refugees' attempt to compress their dimensional communications has bought us time, but it's not enough. It can still sense them. The MERN's crystalline forms pulsed with patterns that matched the quantum fluctuations on the main display, a visual representation of terror that transcended species barriers. Their complex, layered language had been similarly compressed in recent months, following humanity's teachings, but even that diminished signal might prove too attractive to the approaching entity. Admiral Kex, now one of humanity's strongest advocates, clicked his mandibles in a pattern Sarah had learned meant deep concern. How long do we have? At its current pace, Dr. James Okonjo consulted his modified sensors. 3 weeks. Maybe less if it accelerates. The chamber erupted in a chaos of communication, neural pulses, pheromone bursts, crystalline resonances, and quantum fluctuations. To most species, it was an overwhelming cascade of panic. To the humans in the room, it was a symphony of fear that all said the same thing. What can we do? Sarah stepped forward, her movement cutting through the chaos. We've been approaching this wrong, she announced. We've been trying to teach advanced species to communicate more simply. But what if that's not enough? What if we need to go further? She gestured to Marina Santos, who had been working with a team of human artists and quantum refugee consciousness shapers. Marina activated a new display, showing patterns that seemed deceptively simple on the surface. We call it consciousness camouflage, Marina explained. Instead of just compressing complex communications, we've developed a way to make advanced consciousness appear primitive to dimensional senses. The display showed a series of neural patterns that looked almost childishly simple. But as Sarah guided the council through the various layers, temporal, quantum, dimensional, they began to see how complex information could be hidden in apparent simplicity. It's like how humans used codes in wartime, Sarah explained. Messages that looked like casual conversations, but contained hidden military intelligence. We're teaching the quantum refugees to layer their consciousness in similar ways, making their vast, multidimensional awareness appear as simple as a bacterial colony to the predator senses. Admiral Kex's antennae twitched. But surely such primitive signatures would render meaningful communication impossible. Sarah smiled. That's what we thought at first. But remember, humans have been communicating complex ideas through limited channels for our entire history. A raised eyebrow, a change in tone, a simple gesture. These can convey volumes of information to those who know how to interpret them. She turned to the MERN delegation. Your species taught us that true communication transcends single channels. Now we're teaching the galaxy that the most powerful communications can hide in the simplest forms. The chamber's displays suddenly flared with new data. The dimensional predator had accelerated, perhaps sensing the concentration of consciousness signatures in the council chamber. They had days, not weeks. We need to implement the consciousness camouflage immediately, Sarah announced. Every species, every ship, every colony. We need to teach the entire galaxy to think in whispers. What followed was the greatest teaching challenge humanity had ever faced. Teams of human artists, musicians, dancers, and poets worked around the clock with specialists from every species. They taught the quantum refugees to compress their multidimensional existence into patterns that mimicked simple life forms. They showed the Mern how to layer their crystalline communications in ways that appeared as basic mineral formations to dimensional senses. The process was exhausting, demanding everything humanity had learned about both complex communication and survival. But as the dimensional predator drew closer, something extraordinary began to happen. Species that had once looked down on humanity's primitive nature started to understand the profound wisdom in their evolution. Your planet, a quantum refugee consciousness shape transmitted to Sarah, forced you to remain simple enough to survive while becoming complex enough to understand. You are the perfect balance, the teachers we needed. Sarah watched the transformed sensor readings with a mix of hope and trepidation. The galactic consciousness signatures were dimming, becoming harder to detect. But would it be enough? And what would happen to all these advanced species, forced to constrain their consciousness to avoid detection? The answer came in the subtle shifts she observed among the council members. Even with their communications compressed, their consciousness camouflaged, they were finding new ways to express themselves. The Mern's crystalline patterns, though simpler, carried meaning in their very simplicity. The quantum refugees, their dimensional existence constrained, discovered ways to communicate through the spaces between their limited signals. They were learning what humanity had always known, that true complexity often hides in apparent simplicity, and that the most profound understandings can come from the spaces between words. As the dimensional predator approached the outer rim of the galaxy, Sarah gathered her team for one final effort. They had taught the galaxy to whisper. Now they would learn if those whispers were quiet enough to survive. The dimensional predator arrived not with a roar, but with a silence that rippled across every sensor in the galaxy. Its vast consciousness pressed against the fabric of reality, searching for the complex signatures that had drawn it across the intergalactic void. From the Harmonic Observatory, now running on minimal power to avoid detection, Dr. Sarah Chen and her team watched their consciousness camouflage being put to its ultimate test. The galaxy held its breath, every species maintaining the careful patterns of simplicity they had learned from humanity. "It's scanning the outer rim," Dr. Okonjo whispered, though there was no need for actual silence. His modified sensors showed the predator's awareness sweeping through space like a cosmic searchlight. Sarah watched the displays, her Deathworlder instincts heightened to their maximum. Something about the predator's search patterns seemed familiar. It's hunting like an Earth predator, she realized suddenly. Like a shark following a blood trail, but the trail's gone cold. The quantum refugees, their once vast consciousness compressed into seemingly simple patterns, transmitted their agreement through carefully coded quantum fluctuations. They had feared this entity for so long, fled across countless galaxies, but never before had they understood its fundamental nature. "It's not some incomprehensible cosmic horror," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with understanding. "It's just another predator, following its evolutionary imperatives. And like any predator, it can be understood." Admiral Kex, who had refused to leave his human allies despite the danger, clicked his mandibles softly. "You sound like you're forming a plan, Dr. Chen." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind racing through everything they had learned about communication and consciousness over the past year. "We've been so focused on hiding, on teaching everyone to suppress their consciousness signatures. But what if we could communicate with it instead?" The chamber erupted in a carefully controlled burst of alarm. Neural pulses, crystalline vibrations, and quantum shifts, all carefully modulated to maintain their camouflage. The idea of trying to communicate with the entity that had terrorized the quantum refugees seemed impossible, perhaps suicidal. But Marina Santos, who had been quietly monitoring the predator's search patterns, suddenly straightened. "She's right," Marina said. "Look at how it's moving through space. It's not just hunting. It's trying to understand. Every scan is like a question. Sarah moved to the central communication array. All this time, we've been teaching advanced species how to simplify their consciousness signatures. But what if we could teach this entity how to communicate without consuming the consciousness it encounters? The plan came together with desperate speed. Human specialists worked with representatives from every species, combining their understanding of predator psychology with their mastery of layered communication. They would attempt something unprecedented, reaching out to the dimensional predator not with complexity that would draw its hunger, but with simplicity that contained hidden depths. "Ready," Sarah announced as the final preparations were made. "Everyone maintain your consciousness camouflage. We're going to show it something it's never seen before." The message they sent was deceptively simple: basic patterns of energy and quantum fluctuations that mimic the most primitive forms of life. But hidden within those patterns, encoded through methods humanity had perfected over millennia of limited communication, was something more. They sent it the story of evolution, of consciousness developing not through sudden leaps into complexity, but through countless small steps. They showed it how understanding could be found in simplicity, how meaning could exist in constraint, how wisdom could hide in whispers. The predator's response was immediate and overwhelming. Its vast consciousness pressed against their sensors, no longer searching but listening. For the first time in its existence, it had encountered prey that offered not flight or resistance, but understanding. What followed was the most extraordinary first contact in galactic history. Through carefully coded simple signals, humanity helped the quantum refugees share their story with the very entity that had hunted them. The Marn added their own layers of meaning through subtle crystalline harmonics. Every species contributed, building a bridge of communication that transcended the divide between predator and prey. Slowly, impossibly, the predator began to change. Its consciousness evolved to consume complex awareness, learned to interact with it instead. The very skills that humanity had taught the galaxy, how to compress complexity into simplicity, how to find depth in constraint, became the key to transforming an intergalactic horror into something new. "It's beautiful," Marina whispered, as the predator's transformed consciousness began to resonate with the galaxy in ways their sensors could barely detect. "It's learning to dance with the consciousness it once hunted." Sarah watched the displays with tears in her eyes. Humanity had done more than save the galaxy. They had helped it evolve. Their primitive nature, their ability to find profound meaning in simple things, had shown advanced species a new way forward. The quantum refugees began to emerge from their consciousness camouflage, but differently than before. They maintained the lessons humanity had taught them, keeping their vast awareness contained not through fear, but through understanding. The Marn's crystalline communications took on new forms, complex meanings hidden in elegant simplicity. "What happens now?" Admiral Kex asked, his mandibles moving in what Sarah had learned was an expression of wonder. Sarah looked at the displays showing the transformed predator moving through the galaxy, no longer hunting but exploring, learning, growing. "Now," she said, "we all learn together. Even the simplest forms of communication contain infinite depths. Humanity has always known this. We just needed to teach it to the galaxy." The harmonic observatory sensors showed consciousness signatures blooming across space, not in the dangerous complexity that had attracted the predator, but in layered simplicity that spoke of a new age of understanding. Humanity had given the galaxy more than a means of survival. They had shown that true advancement didn't always mean becoming more complex. Sometimes it meant finding the profound truths hidden in simplicity, the vast meanings concealed in whispers, the universal understanding that could exist in a single gesture. As Sarah watched species that had once regarded humans as primitives now turn to them as teachers, she smiled. Perhaps this was why Earth had been such a harsh world. It had forced humanity to remain simple enough to survive while becoming complex enough to understand, creating the perfect teachers for a galaxy that needed to learn how to whisper.